Three Shadowless People, Myths of Invisible Shadows horror story. Welcome to our channel where we delve into the darkest corners of the human psyche. Tonight we explore the chilling world of the Shadowless People, unseen, unheard, but always present. These beings defy the laws of light and shadow, a testament to unseen horrors lurking beyond our perception. Prepare yourself for three terrifying tales of encounters with the Shadowless People, questioning the very nature of our reality. It began subtly, a series of unsettling incidents in the old Victorian house at the edge of town. The house had always been a subject of local legends, whispered tales of ghostly apparitions and unexplained phenomena. But for John, it was simply home, a place filled with memories of his childhood and family. John, living alone in his ancestral home, started noticing things. At first, it was just small, almost imperceptible changes. A picture frame slightly askew, a door that he was sure he had closed now standing ajar. He dismissed these as the quirks of an old house, but the incidents grew more frequent and harder to ignore. A glass shattering in the middle of the night, the scent of ozone lingering in the air, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. These occurrences left John on edge, his nerves frayed. He tried to rationalize them, attributing them to drafts or the settling of the old house, but deep down he knew something was amiss. One night, as John sat by the fireplace, he felt a distinct chill. The warmth of the fire did nothing to dispel the cold that seemed to seep into his very bones. He wrapped his blanket tighter around himself, but the chill persisted, an unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the house. He looked up and saw it, or rather, didn't see it, an absence of light in the doorway, a void that seemed to swallow the very essence of the room. It was as if the darkness had taken on a life of its own, a palpable presence that filled him with dread. An absence of light in the doorway, a void. It was more than just darkness, it was an emptiness that seemed to pull at his soul, a black hole that threatened to consume everything in its path. John felt a primal fear, an instinctual terror that he couldn't explain. The air grew heavy, the room shrinking around him. It was as if the walls were closing in, the space becoming smaller and more oppressive with each passing second. John struggled to breathe, his chest tight with fear. The atmosphere was thick, almost tangible, pressing down on him from all sides. John, paralyzed by fear, watched as the Shadowless One glided across the room. It moved with an eerie grace, a silent spectre that seemed to float just above the ground. Its presence was undeniable, a dark force that filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. Days turned into sleepless nights, each more terrifying than the last. John found himself unable to rest, his mind constantly replaying the events of that night. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind, sent him into a state of panic. He was trapped in a cycle of fear and exhaustion, unable to escape the horrors that plagued him. Strange occurrences increased, doors slamming shut with a force that shook the house, eerie whispers that seemed to come from the very walls, the stench of ozone that lingered long after the events had passed. John felt like he was losing his grip on reality, each incident chipping away at his sanity. John spiraled into fear and paranoia, unable to rationalize the events. He tried to find logical explanations, but none of them made sense. The house seemed to be alive, a malevolent entity that thrived on his fear. He felt like a prisoner in his own home, constantly on edge, waiting for the next terrifying event. One evening he heard a scratching sound at the locked door. It was a slow, deliberate noise, like nails dragging across the wood. John froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound was relentless, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. The doorknob slowly turned, revealing impenetrable darkness. John watched in horror as the door creaked open, the void beyond it seeming to pulse with a life of its own. He felt a cold dread wash over him, his body trembling with fear. The Shadowless One stood in the doorway, its presence undeniable. It was a figure of pure darkness, an entity that seemed to absorb all light. John felt a wave of terror crash over him, his mind struggling to comprehend the sight before him. The air crackled with unseen energy, and John felt a cold dread. It was as if the very atmosphere was charged with a malevolent force, a dark energy that seemed to seep into his very being. He felt a chill run down his spine, his body paralyzed with fear. He knew he was trapped, his fate sealed within the house. There was no escape from the horrors that plagued him, no way to break free from the grip of the Shadowless One. John felt a sense of resignation, a bleak acceptance of his fate. The scratching stopped, silence descended, and the Shadowless One was gone. But the silence was not a relief. It was a heavy, oppressive stillness that filled the room with an eerie sense of foreboding. John knew that the entity was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. But the fear remained, a constant reminder of the unseen horrors. John lived in a state of perpetual anxiety, always looking over his shoulder, always expecting the next terrifying event. The house had become a prison, a place of unending torment. John never saw the Shadowless One again, but he always felt its presence. It was a constant, oppressive force that haunted him day and night. He knew that he would never be free of it, that the house would always be a place of fear and darkness. The campfire crackled, casting flickering shadows among the trees. The warmth of the fire was a comforting contrast to the cool night air, and the sound of the crackling wood was almost hypnotic. A group of friends, their laughter echoing through the forest, sat around the fire. They shared stories and jokes, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. The camaraderie was palpable, a sense of togetherness that only a night in the wilderness could bring. The air was crisp, the stars a million pinpricks of light in the vast dark sky. It was a perfect night for camping, with the Milky Way stretching across the heavens like a shimmering river of stars. As the night wore on, the stories took a darker turn, becoming eerie and filled with suspense. The friends leaned in closer to the fire, their faces serious as they listened intently. One story in particular sent shivers down their spines, the legend of the Shadowless One. It was a tale passed down through generations of a figure that roamed the forest, unseen, but always felt. Laughter turned to nervous glances as they peered into the darkness beyond the firelight. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees casting long, ominous shadows. Mark, the skeptic of the group, scoffed at the idea. He dismissed the story as just another campfire tale meant to scare the gullible. His words did little to ease the tension that had settled over the group. The atmosphere grew heavy, the once cheerful mood now replaced by a sense of unease. As the fire died down, they retreated to their tents, each person lost in their own thoughts. The forest was silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Sarah lay awake, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Her mind replayed the story of the Shadowless One, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Suddenly the moonlight was gone, swallowed by a thick blanket of clouds. The darkness was complete, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. She peered out of her tent, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw it, or rather didn't see it, an absence of light at the edge of the campsite, a void where there should have been shadows. The absence of light was unnerving, a black hole that seemed to absorb everything around it. The air grew heavy, the temperature plummeting as if the warmth of the fire had never existed. The air grew heavy, the temperature plummeting. It was as if the very essence of the forest had changed, becoming something dark and foreboding. The Shadowless One glided towards the tents, a figure of pure darkness that seemed to float above the ground. It moved with an eerie grace, silent and menacing. Panic welled up inside her, a cold, paralyzing fear that made her want to scream. She knew she had to do something, anything, to escape the approaching terror. She scrambled out of her tent, her movements frantic and uncoordinated. She raced to Mark's tent, her mind a whirlwind of fear and desperation. Mark unzipped the tent flap, annoyed at being woken up. His irritation quickly turned to concern when he saw the look of terror on Sarah's face. Sarah whispered urgently, "It's the Shadowless One." Her voice trembled, and she could barely get the words out. Mark scoffed, ready to dismiss her fears. But then he saw it too. The Shadowless One, a figure of darkness, standing at the edge of the campsite. The Shadowless One had reached the campsite, its presence undeniable. It was a figure of pure darkness, an entity that seemed to absorb all light and hope. The air crackled with unseen energy, a palpable tension that made the hair on the back of their necks stand up. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being stretched to its breaking point. Mark and Sarah watched in horror, their minds struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. The Shadowless One was real, and it was here. They knew they had to escape. There was no time to waste. They woke the others, their voices urgent and filled with fear. They woke the others and fled into the forest, their footsteps pounding against the earth. The darkness seemed to close in around them, but they didn't stop. They ran until they emerged at dawn, exhausted and breathless. The first light of day was a welcome sight, a promise of safety and normalcy. They never returned to the campsite. The memory of that night was too fresh, too terrifying to face again. The memory of the Shadowless One was forever etched into their minds. It was a story they would tell for years to come. A chilling reminder of the unseen horrors that lurk in the shadows. A chilling reminder of the unseen horrors lurking in the shadows. The forest, once a place of beauty and tranquility, had become a place of fear and mystery. Chapter 3. The Neighbour. The old apartment building had a certain charm. Its vintage architecture and intricate details gave it a timeless beauty that drew people in. For Emily, it felt like the perfect place to call home. She was enchanted by the high ceilings, the ornate mouldings, and the sense of history that seemed to whisper through the walls. Little did she know it harboured a dark secret. The building's history was not just one of charm and elegance, but also of mystery and unease. It began subtly unsettling occurrences that sent shivers down her spine. At first she dismissed them as figments of her imagination, but they soon became too frequent to ignore. Footsteps echoed in the empty hallways. The feeling of being watched was constant, and a persistent cold spot lingered in her living room, no matter how high she turned up the heat. One evening, she noticed her neighbour's door ajar. It was unusual, as she had never seen anyone enter or leave that apartment. She had never seen her neighbour. The apartment seemed perpetually vacant, yet she could sense a presence. Curiosity compelled her to investigate. She felt an inexplicable urge to uncover the truth behind the mysterious door. She knocked lightly, no response. The silence was deafening, amplifying her growing sense of dread. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, echoing through the empty hallway. The apartment was shrouded in darkness. It felt as though the shadows were alive, wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. Emily stepped inside, her heart pounding. Each step felt like an eternity, the air thick with anticipation. She called out, "Hello?" Silence. The emptiness of the response was more terrifying than any sound. She took a hesitant step forward. The floorboards creaked under her weight, adding to the eerie atmosphere. And then she saw it, or rather, didn't see it. An absence of light in the centre of the room, a void that seemed to swallow everything around it. An absence of light in the centre of the room. It was as if the darkness had a life of its own, pulsating with a malevolent energy. The air grew heavy, the temperature plummeting. She could see her breath in the cold, misty air. The Shadowless one stood motionless. Its presence was overwhelming, a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb all light. Emily's mind raced, trying to process the sight. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She realized the legends were true. The stories she had heard about the building's haunted past were not just tales, but reality. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt like lead. She was paralyzed by fear, unable to move or make a sound. The Shadowless one seemed to be observing her. She had to escape. The realization hit her like a wave, and she knew she couldn't stay there any longer. Mustering her strength, she fled to her apartment. Her footsteps echoed through the hallway as she ran, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had not seen the last of it. The Shadowless one would return, and she had to be prepared for when it did. Thank you for joining us on this spine-chilling journey. We've explored the unsettling tales of the Shadowless people. If you found yourself captivated, like this video and subscribe for more. Until next time, remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we can't see, the ones that cast no shadow.